The funeral director's pen scratched against the death certificate as I signed my wife's final paperwork. 43 years of marriage reduced to official stamps and signatures. When my son walked in with his wife, I expected comfort, maybe even tears. Instead, he glanced at his watch and said, "Dad, you can't bring Mom back, and my wife's birthday party is tonight. It only happens once a year." The words hit like ice water in my veins. 24 hours later, he stood in my kitchen asking for the one thing. Before we continue, please subscribe and let us know where you're listening from. The funeral home smelled of lilies and disinfectant, a combination that would haunt me for weeks afterward. I sat in the burgundy leather chair, my calloused hands trembling as I filled out form after form. Rachel's wedding ring sat in a small velvet pouch beside me, 43 years of love reduced to 2 ounces of gold. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, spoke in hushed tones about viewing times and service arrangements, but his words felt like they were coming from underwater. Jacob arrived at 4:30, exactly 30 minutes after we'd agreed to meet. His designer suit cost more than I'd spent on clothes in 5 years, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Lauren followed behind him, her heels even louder, scrolling through her phone with manicured fingers that caught the light from her diamond bracelet, the one Rachel and I had given her for her birthday 2 years ago. The funeral director began explaining the arrangements when Jacob's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his face lighting up at whatever message he'd received. Lauren leaned over to look, and they both smiled, actually smiled, while sitting 3 feet from Rachel's casket selection catalog. My throat tightened as I watched them, wondering when my son had become someone I no longer recognized. "Dad, we need to talk about timing," Jacob said, sliding his phone back into his pocket and glancing at his watch. The casual way he said it, as if we were discussing weekend plans instead of his mother's funeral, made my stomach drop. "Lauren's birthday party is tonight. We've had it planned for months, sent out invitations, and booked the caterer. You know how these things work." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the moment when he'd realize what he was saying. But his expression remained serious, even slightly impatient, as if I was the one being unreasonable. Lauren nodded beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line of sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "Your mother died yesterday," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the funeral home's soft classical music. "The service is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Jacob shifted in his seat, that same restless energy he'd had as a child when he wanted something. "Dad, you can't bring Mom back, and my wife's birthday party is tonight. It only happens once a year. Everyone's already RSVP'd. The deposits are non-refundable." Mom would understand. She always said family should celebrate life, right? The funeral director cleared his throat uncomfortably and excused himself, leaving us alone in the viewing room. I sat there, surrounded by flower arrangements and sympathy cards, watching my son check his phone again, while his mother lay in a morgue 6 blocks away. "We'll stay for the service, obviously," Lauren added, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness she used when she wanted something. "But we'll need to leave by 6 to set up. The party starts at 8, and I've been planning this for months. Some of Jacob's business contacts will be there. It's important for his career." I looked at my son. This man I'd raised, whose college tuition I'd paid by working double shifts, whose first house down payment had come from my construction business savings. He was checking Instagram while his mother's funeral arrangement sat unfinished on the table between us. Jacob stood up suddenly, straightening his tie. "Actually, Dad, we should probably head out now. Lauren needs to pick up the cake, and I promised I'd help with decorations." He leaned down and gave me a brief, awkward hug that smelled of expensive cologne and felt like a business transaction. "You've got this handled, right? You're good with details." I watched them walk toward the exit, Lauren's heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Jacob held the door for her, and just before they disappeared, I heard her laugh at something on her phone, a bright, careless sound that echoed through the silent funeral home. The funeral director returned 10 minutes later, finding me still sitting in the same chair, staring at the empty doorway. He asked if I needed help with the arrangements, his voice gentle with the kind of professional sympathy that comes from seeing too many families fall apart in moments of grief. That night, I sat alone in the house Rachel and I had shared for 38 years, holding her wedding ring and listening to the silence. My phone buzzed every few minutes with notifications from Jacob's Instagram account, party preparations, champagne bottles, Lauren posing with birthday balloons that spelled out 32 and fabulous. Each notification felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. The last post came at 11:47 p.m., a photo of Jacob raising a champagne flute, his face flushed with alcohol in celebration, with the caption, "To my beautiful wife on her special day. Nothing could make this night more perfect." In the background, I could see at least 50 people, all laughing and dancing, while Rachel lay cold and alone. I turned off my phone and sat in the darkness, wondering how I'd raised a son who could celebrate while his mother's body waited for burial. The next morning, I woke at 8:30 to the sound of lawnmowers starting up across the neighborhood, the normal rhythm of suburban Thursday morning that felt surreal after everything that had happened. My body ached from sleeping fitfully for only 4 hours, but my mind felt clearer than it had since Rachel's death. The financial documents were still spread across the dining room table where I'd left them, a paper trail of 35 years of systematic deception that looked even more damning in daylight. I made coffee using Rachel's favorite mug, the one with hand-painted sunflowers from a craft fair we'd visited on our 20th anniversary. Through the kitchen window, I could see Jacob's house 3 blocks away, the remnants of the party scattered across the lawn like evidence of a crime scene. Overturned chairs, empty champagne bottles glinting in the morning sun, streamers hanging limply from the oak tree where I'd once hung a tire swing for him to play on. The photos kept coming throughout the night. Jacob's business partners from the marketing firm, laughing and raising glasses. Lauren's sorority sisters, all blonde highlights and designer purses. An ice sculpture in the shape of a swan, a 3-tier cake that probably fed 50 people. At midnight, Jacob posted a video of Lauren blowing out candles while everyone sang, her face glowing with happiness and champagne. Not once, in any photo or video, did I see a moment of acknowledgement that his mother had died just 1 day earlier. I closed the laptop and walked into Rachel's sewing room, where she'd spent countless hours altering Jacob's school clothes when money was tight, taking in hems and letting out waistbands as he grew. Her reading glasses still sat folded beside her chair next to a half-finished cross-stitch that read, "Family First." The irony wasn't lost on me. In her desk drawer, underneath patterns and thread catalogs, I found the letter. My name was written on the envelope in Rachel's careful cursive, along with the words, "Only if something happens to me." My hands shook as I opened it, recognizing her handwriting from 40 years of grocery lists and birthday cards. "My dearest Alexander," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I pray you're not alone with your grief. I'm writing this because I've watched our son change over the past 5 years, and it breaks my heart. The boy who used to bring you lunch at construction sites, who cried when you hurt your back and couldn't work for 3 weeks, who promised he'd take care of us when we got old, that boy has become someone I barely recognize." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing observations I'd been too blind to see. How Jacob only called when he needed money. How Lauren's influence had turned him against our simple lifestyle. How they'd made jokes about our small house, our old car, my work clothes. Rachel had heard it all, noticed it all, and tried to shield me from the truth. "I know you'll want to keep helping him," the letter continued. "It's who you are. You fix things, you provide, you sacrifice. But Alexander, sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone face the consequences of their choices. Don't let him use your grief against you. Don't let him take advantage of your big heart when I'm not there to protect it." I set the letter down and walked to our bedroom, where Rachel's side of the closet still held her clothes. In the back, behind her winter coats, I found a shoebox filled with documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing Jacob's mortgage payments, all made by automatic transfer from our account. Credit card bills I'd been paying for 3 years without knowing they existed. College loan statements that should have been paid off years ago, but somehow kept getting deferred. As I spread the papers across our bed, a pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. Every major purchase Jacob and Lauren had made, their house, their cars, their vacations, even Lauren's engagement ring, had been funded, either directly or indirectly, by money that came from me. The successful marketing career Jacob always bragged about barely covered their basic expenses. Everything else, all the luxury they flaunted on social media, came from the construction business Rachel and I had built with 50 years of 6-day work weeks and skipped vacations. The final document in the box was a copy of our will, with Rachel's handwritten notes in the margins. She'd been researching how to change it, how to protect our assets from what she called financial manipulation. Her notes referenced conversations with a lawyer about setting up trusts, about ensuring Jacob couldn't access everything at once if something happened to us. She'd been trying to save him from himself, even as she was dying. At 3 a.m, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by evidence of my own blindness. Outside, Jacob's house, the one I'd quietly helped finance, glowed with party lights that had finally been turned off. Through his bedroom window, I could see the blue flicker of a television. He was probably scrolling through photos from the party, reliving the celebration while I sat here discovering how thoroughly I'd been used. My phone buzzed with one final Instagram notification from Lauren. "Best birthday ever! So grateful for this amazing life and the people who make it possible." The caption was accompanied by a photo of her and Jacob in bed, surrounded by birthday gifts, both of them holding champagne glasses and grinning at the camera. I turned off the phone and stared out the window at the construction equipment sitting in my driveway, tools that had built a business, paid for a house, sent a son to college, and apparently funded a lifestyle I'd never been invited to enjoy. For the first time in my 67 years, I understood what Rachel had been trying to tell me in that letter. By 4 a.m., exhaustion finally overtook the adrenaline of discovery. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom Rachel and I had shared for 38 years, her side of the closet still holding her clothes, her pillow still carrying the faint scent of her lavender shampoo. But for the first time since her death, I fell asleep without the crushing weight of grief pressing against my chest. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally decided to stop being taken advantage of by someone who'd mistaken his love for weakness. At exactly 9 o'clock, Jacob appeared at my kitchen door, carrying 2 Starbucks cups and wearing designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky. His BMW, the one whose payments I'd apparently been making for 2 years, sat in my driveway next to the old Ford pickup I'd driven for 15 years. He walked in without knocking, the way he had as a teenager, but everything else about him belonged to a stranger. "Morning, Dad. Brought you coffee." He set the cup down and removed his sunglasses, revealing bloodshot eyes and the slightly green complexion of someone fighting a serious hangover. He was still wearing the same expensive polo shirt from last night's party. I recognized it from Lauren's Instagram posts, wrinkled now and carrying the faint smell of champagne and cigarette smoke from the celebration that had lasted until dawn. I stayed seated at the table, my hands wrapped around the coffee mug I'd been nursing since 8:30. The financial documents from last night were safely hidden in Rachel's sewing room, but their weight pressed against my chest like a physical thing. Jacob slumped into the chair across from me, the same spot where he used to eat cereal before school while Rachel packed his lunch with the careful attention of a woman who understood the value of every dollar. "Hell of a party last night," he said, pulling out his phone to scroll through photos. "Lauren was so happy. Did you see the pictures? That ice sculpture cost $800, but her face when she saw it, totally worth it." He turned the screen toward me, showing a video of Lauren squealing with delight as waiters unveiled the swan. In the background, I could see the faces of his friends, all young and glossy and expensive looking. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. Jacob interpreted my silence as interest and launched into a detailed recap of the evening. The champagne that cost $40 a bottle, the DJ who'd flown in from Miami, the photographer who'd captured every moment for their lifestyle brand. He spoke with the casual pride of someone discussing a business investment, each extravagant detail delivered as evidence of his success. The best part was when Tommy, you remember Tommy from my college fraternity, when he pulled me aside and said this was the kind of party that gets talked about for years. He wants to hire us to plan his engagement celebration. Jacob's eyes lit up with the prospect of turning his wife's birthday into a networking opportunity. Lauren's already got ideas. She thinks we could start a side business, high-end event planning for people who really know how to celebrate life. The phrase hit me like a slap. Celebrate life. While his mother lay in a grave that was still settling, while the funeral flowers were barely wilted, he was planning to monetize the party he'd chosen over Rachel's burial. "Speaking of business," Jacob continued, his tone shifting to the practiced casualness I now recognized as a prelude to asking for money, "I've got an incredible opportunity that I wanted to run by you." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table where Rachel and I had eaten dinner for 38 years, and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. The documents were impressive. Glossy brochures, financial projections, partnership agreements with companies I'd heard of. Jacob spread them across the table with the confidence of a salesman who'd never had a pitch rejected, his hangover apparently forgotten in the excitement of potential profit. "There's this new development going up on the east side," he explained, pointing to architectural renderings of luxury condominiums. "High-end urban living, the kind of place where young professionals want to invest. The marketing firm is looking for partners to help fund the promotional campaign, and they've offered me a chance to buy in. It's a guaranteed return of 30% within 18 months. I stared at the papers, recognizing the same breathless enthusiasm Jacob had brought home from college when he'd discovered stock trading, cryptocurrency, and half a dozen other guaranteed ways to get rich quickly. Each venture had required startup capital that somehow always came from my construction business account. "The thing is," Jacob continued, his voice dropping to the tone he used when he was about to ask for something big, "the minimum investment is $500,000. I've got most of it, but I need someone to co-sign on a business loan for the rest. Just as a formality, my credit is excellent, but they want additional security for this level of investment." $500,000. I thought about the mortgage payments I'd been making on his house, the credit cards I'd been paying off without knowing they existed, the college loans that should have been finished years ago. $500,000 that would disappear into another of his schemes while I continued working construction jobs that left my back aching and my hands raw. "I know it's a lot," Jacob said, misreading my silence as hesitation rather than the slow-burning rage it actually was. "But Dad, this is my chance to really make something of myself, to build the kind of life Lauren deserves, the kind of future Mom always wanted for our family." He reached across the table and put his hand on my arm, the same gesture he'd used as a child when he wanted a toy or a treat. The casual mention of Rachel, of what she always wanted, made something snap inside my chest. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and sacrificed for, sitting in my kitchen asking for $500,000 while wearing the watch I'd bought him, drinking coffee purchased with money I'd earned, planning to fund his future with assets I'd built over 50 years of physical labor. "I'll need to think about it," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "This is a big decision. Give me 24 hours to review everything." But I was lying. The decision had already crystallized the moment he'd walked into my kitchen still reeking of champagne, asking for $500,000 while his mother's funeral arrangements sat unfinished. I'd known exactly what I was going to do from the instant I saw him in those wrinkled party clothes, carrying himself with the entitled confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in his life. Jacob's face lit up with relief and premature victory. "Of course, absolutely. Take all the time you need." He gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder, then stood up and straightened his shirt with the satisfied air of someone who'd just closed a deal. "I'll call you tomorrow afternoon, and we can drive to the bank together. This is going to change everything, Dad. Mom would be so proud." He paused at the kitchen door, his hand on the frame where Rachel used to hang her garden calendar. "Oh, and Lauren wanted me to ask, would you mind if we borrowed your truck next weekend? We're moving some furniture for the new apartment we're looking at. Nothing too heavy, just some pieces from that antique store she likes." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain level. Jacob grinned and walked out to his BMW, already pulling out his phone to share the good news with someone, probably Lauren, probably about how easy it had been to secure funding for their latest adventure. Through the kitchen window, I watched him drive away, his expensive car disappearing down the same street where I'd taught him to ride a bicycle, where Rachel had watched him walk to his first day of school, where we'd believed we were raising a son who would carry on the values we'd tried to instill. I sat alone at the table, surrounded by the silence of a house that no longer held Rachel's presence, and began to understand that some forms of betrayal run so deep they change the very foundation of who you thought you were as a father. By noon, I'd spread every financial document from Rachel's shoebox across my dining room table, creating a paper trail that told the story of 35 years of systematic deception. Bank statements, credit card bills, mortgage papers, loan agreements, each one signed by me, each one benefiting Jacob, each one hidden from my daily awareness through automatic payments and careful misdirection. I called my lawyer, Tom Bradley, who'd been handling my business and personal affairs since the early 80s. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd seen families destroy themselves over money countless times before. "Alexander, I need you to understand something before we go any further. Legally, you signed these documents. You authorized these payments. From a court's perspective, you gave these gifts willingly." "But I didn't know about half of them," I said, staring at a credit card statement showing $18,000 in charges from a single weekend trip to Las Vegas I'd never heard about. "He had access to my business accounts. He's been signing my name on things for years." Tom's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler but no less firm. "That's fraud, Alexander. Financial elder abuse. We could pursue it, but it would mean sending your son to prison. Is that what you want?" I looked around the dining room where Rachel and I had hosted every holiday for the past 3 decades, where Jacob had done homework while we cooked dinner, where we'd celebrated his graduation with a cake that cost $20 but felt like the greatest feast in the world. "I don't want him to go to prison," I said. "I want him to understand what he's done." After hanging up, I drove to First National Bank, where I'd done business for 40 years. The young manager, a woman who looked barely older than Jacob, pulled up my accounts on her computer screen and confirmed what I'd already suspected. 3 checking accounts, 2 savings accounts, and a business line of credit, all accessible to Jacob through power of attorney documents I vaguely remembered signing years ago when he'd started helping with my finances. "Mr. Harris, your son has been very active in managing your accounts," she said diplomatically, scrolling through pages of transactions. "He's been making substantial transfers and payments, but everything appears to be properly authorized. The power of attorney gives him broad discretionary access to act on your behalf." I asked her to print everything, every transaction, every transfer, every payment made on Jacob's behalf for the past 5 years. The stack of paper she handed me was 2 inches thick and represented more money than Rachel and I had ever imagined we'd earn in our lifetimes. Money that had flowed steadily into Jacob's life while we continued to drive an old pickup truck and shop with grocery store coupons. Rachel's funeral service that afternoon at St. Matthew's Church should have been a celebration of 43 years of love, service, and devotion to family. I arrived an hour early to make sure everything was perfect. The flowers arranged just as she would have liked them, the hymns she'd hummed while cooking dinner, the readings from the Bible she'd kept on her nightstand for 30 years. By 2 o'clock, the church was filled with neighbors, co-workers from the food bank where she'd volunteered, members of her book club, and construction crews I'd worked with who remembered her kindness during company picnics. 26 people who understood that Rachel Harris had made their lives better simply by being in the world. Jacob and Lauren never came. I sat in the front pew, staring at the empty seats beside me that should have held my son and daughter-in-law, while Pastor Williams spoke about Rachel's devotion to family, her pride in raising a son who would carry on her values of hard work and compassion. The irony was so sharp I could taste it like metal in my mouth. At 3:15, my phone buzzed with a text from Jacob. "Sorry, Dad. Lauren's having car trouble and I had to take her to the dealership. We'll visit Mom's grave later this week. Love you." The message arrived while Pastor Williams was reading from Proverbs about honoring your father and mother, while 26 people who barely knew Rachel showed more respect for her memory than her own son. I turned off the phone and listened to the eulogies from people who remembered her volunteer work, her homemade cookies for school fundraisers, her quiet generosity to families going through hard times. Not one person mentioned the successful son she'd sacrificed everything to raise because there was nothing worth mentioning. That evening, I sat in Rachel's sewing room and called my neighbor, Hannah Campbell, who'd lived next door for 23 years and had watched Jacob grow up. Her voice was careful when I explained what I'd discovered, the kind of care that comes from wanting to be supportive without saying something you can't take back. "Alexander, honey, I don't want to speak ill of my family," she said slowly. "But I've been wondering about some things for a while now, like how Jacob can afford that lifestyle on a marketing salary, or why Lauren was posting about a $5,000 purse the same week you were out there in 90-degree heat fixing your roof yourself." Hannah had noticed things I'd been too blind to see: the expensive cars in Jacob's driveway, the designer clothes, the constant stream of luxury vacations documented on social media. Things that didn't add up for a young couple just starting their careers, but made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of a father who'd been subsidizing their entire lifestyle without realizing it. "There's something else," Hannah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Last month I overheard Lauren on the phone in her backyard. She was talking to someone about how easy it was to get money from the old man and how they'd never have to worry about retirement because they'd inherit everything anyway. I didn't want to tell you, especially with Rachel being so sick, but it made my stomach turn." After hanging up, I sat in the silence of the house and felt something shift inside my chest. Not the crushing weight of grief I'd carried since Rachel's death, but something sharper and more focused. For 35 years, I'd been proud of my son's success, bragging to neighbors and colleagues about his achievements, his beautiful home, his thriving career. Now I understood that every accomplishment had been built on a foundation of my labor and Rachel's sacrifice. I walked into the garage where my tools hung in neat rows on pegboard walls, each one carefully maintained and organized the way Rachel had taught me when we first started the construction business. These tools had built houses, renovated kitchens, repaired foundations, and earned enough money to fund a lifestyle I'd never been invited to enjoy. My phone buzzed with a text from Jacob. "Dad, talk to Lauren about the investment opportunity. She's so excited. This is going to be amazing for our future. Can't wait to get to the bank tomorrow afternoon. Love you." I stared at the message, noting the casual assumption that I'd already agreed, the complete absence of any mention of his mother's funeral, the enthusiastic exclamation points that treated my life savings like an exciting game. "Love you." 2 words that had once meant everything to me, now felt like the signature on a contract I'd never agreed to sign. I scrolled back through weeks of text messages from Jacob, looking for any mention of Rachel's illness, her pain, her fear. I found discussions about business opportunities, requests for money, complaints about work, updates on Lauren's latest purchases. But in the 3 months before Rachel's death, as she underwent chemotherapy and radiation treatments that left her weak and nauseous, Jacob had sent exactly 2 messages asking about her condition. That night, I called the bank's after-hours customer service line and froze all the accounts Jacob had access to. The representative confirmed that as the primary account holder, I had the right to revoke power of attorney privileges at any time. It would take effect immediately and send automatic notification to all parties involved. I hung up and sat in the darkness of the kitchen, knowing that somewhere across town, Jacob's phone was probably already buzzing with alerts about declined transactions and frozen accounts. Friday morning's bank appointment would be very different from what he expected. For the first time since Rachel's death, I fell asleep without the crushing weight of grief pressing against my chest. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd finally decided to stop being taken advantage of by someone who'd mistaken his love for weakness. Jacob's phone call came at 7 a.m., his voice tight with panic and barely controlled anger. "Dad, what the hell happened to the accounts? My card got declined at Starbucks, and Lauren's card was rejected at the grocery store. The bank said you froze everything?" I sat at my kitchen table, the same spot where he'd pitched his investment scheme the day before, and sipped coffee from the same mug he'd dismissed as old-fashioned. "We need to talk," I said calmly. "Meet me at Mickey's Diner on 5th Street at 10 a.m. Come alone." "Dad, this is insane. You can't just cut off access without warning. I've got bills due, rent payments, a reputation to maintain. Lauren's freaking out. She's supposed to have lunch with her sorority sisters at that new place downtown, and now she can't even pay for parking. The casual mention of lunch plans while demanding access to money that wasn't his crystallized everything I'd learned in the past day. 10 a.m., Jacob. We'll discuss everything then. I hung up before he could argue further. Mickey's Diner had been serving the same menu since 1973, the kind of place where construction workers grabbed breakfast before dawn and retirees lingered over coffee and newspaper crosswords. I arrived early and chose a booth in the center of the dining room, not tucked away in a corner where family drama could be hidden, but right where the Tuesday morning regulars could witness whatever was about to unfold. Hannah Campbell was there, as I'd known she would be. She came every Tuesday for their famous blueberry pancakes and local gossip. Tom Bradley sat 3 booths away, not by coincidence, but by design. I'd asked him to be there, not as my lawyer, but as a witness to whatever transpired. The waitress, a woman named Dolores, who'd been serving coffee here since the Carter administration, refilled my cup and asked if I was expecting company. Jacob burst through the door at exactly 10:05, his designer jacket wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. He'd clearly thrown on the first clothes he could find, and the result was a man who looked like his carefully constructed image was coming apart at the seams. He spotted me immediately and strode across the diner with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never been told no by his father. "This is ridiculous," he said, sliding into the booth across from me without removing his jacket. "Freezing the accounts? Really? What's next? Changing the locks on your house? Lauren's crying. The mortgage company called about missed payments, and my business partners think I'm having a financial crisis." I reached into the manila folder beside me and pulled out the first document, a timeline I'd created the night before, typed on Rachel's old computer and printed on pages that looked like a legal brief. "Let's start with Tuesday, August 15th, I said, my voice carrying across the diner with the clarity of a man who'd spent 50 years shouting orders over construction noise. 3 p.m. Your mother dies in my arms at Mercy General Hospital." Jacob's face flushed red. "Dad, keep your voice down. People are staring." "Wednesday, 4:30 p.m., I continued, raising my voice slightly. "You arrive 30 minutes late to the funeral home, checking your phone while I sign death certificates." Several diners had stopped eating to listen, their faces showing the kind of horrified fascination that comes from witnessing someone's private business become a public spectacle. 6 p.m. You leave me alone at the funeral home to attend your wife's birthday party. 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., 47 Instagram posts documenting the celebration while your mother's body lies in the morgue. I slid the printed screenshots across the table, each one time-stamped and captioned with Lauren's cheerful commentary about the best birthday ever. Jacob reached for the papers, his hands shaking with either rage or panic. "You screenshotted our private social media? You're stalking us online like some kind of crazy person?" "Thursday morning, 9 a.m., I said, pulling out the next set of documents. "You arrive at my house asking for $500,000 to fund another business venture. 2 days after your mother's death, 1 day after abandoning me at the funeral home." Dolores approached our table with a coffee pot, her eyes wide with the kind of fascination that comes from 40 years of serving coffee to people having the worst days of their lives. "You boys need menus?" she asked, though it was clear neither of us was thinking about food. "Just coffee," I said. Jacob waved her away with the impatient gesture of someone who thought service workers were beneath his notice. I spread more papers across the table, bank statements, credit card bills, mortgage documents. "This is where it gets interesting," I said, my voice now loud enough that conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely. 5 years of financial records showing every dollar you've borrowed, spent, or stolen from the business your mother and I built with 50 years of physical labor." "Stolen?" Jacob's voice cracked on the word. "I never stole anything. You gave me access to those accounts. You signed the power of attorney documents." "I signed papers I thought would help you manage my finances when I got older," I said. "I didn't sign permission for you to fund a lifestyle that costs more per month than your mother and I spent in an entire year." I pulled out Hannah's written statement, the one she'd prepared the night before detailing Lauren's phone conversation about manipulating the old man for money. Jacob's face went white as he read Hannah's neat handwriting. His eyes darted around the diner, taking in the faces of people who were no longer pretending not to listen. Mickey's diner had become a theater, and he was the unwilling star of a performance he couldn't control. "Mrs. Campbell is lying," he said desperately. "She's some bitter old woman who's jealous of our success." "Our success?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air. "Jacob, your take-home pay from the marketing firm is $42,000 a year. Your mortgage alone costs $60,000. Your car payments are $18,000. Lauren's shopping budget exceeds $30,000 annually. Explain to everyone here how that math works." The diner had gone completely silent except for the hum of the coffee machine and the distant sound of traffic on 5th Street. Jacob looked around wildly, realizing that his financial house of cards was being dismantled in front of an audience of strangers who would remember this moment and share it with their own families over dinner. "You want to know what your mother's last words were?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than all my shouting. She said, "Don't let him use your grief against you." She knew, Jacob. She'd been watching you become someone she didn't recognize, and she died knowing her son had turned into a stranger. He stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but the dawning realization that the safety net he'd taken for granted his entire life had just disappeared. "You can't do this. I have rights. I'll take you to court." "With what money?" I asked. "Your lawyer bills alone will cost more than you make in 6 months, and Jacob, everything I've done is perfectly legal. I'm simply stopping the voluntary financial support I've been providing to an ungrateful child who chose a birthday party over his mother's funeral." The words hit him like physical blows. He stumbled backward, bumping into Dolores, who was refilling coffee at the table behind him. Several diners had pulled out their phones, not to record, but to text family members about the spectacle unfolding in their quiet neighborhood restaurant. Jacob left without another word, pushing through the door with enough force to make the bell above it ring like an alarm. Through the window, I watched him fumble with his phone, probably calling Lauren to explain why their carefully constructed lifestyle was about to collapse. I sat in the booth for another hour, finishing my coffee while neighbors and strangers approached to share their own stories about ungrateful children, financial manipulation, and the difficulty of knowing when love becomes enabling. Mickey's diner had become a confessional, and I had somehow become both priest and penitent. 3 weeks later, I stood in the cemetery placing fresh roses on Rachel's grave, the same roses she'd grown in our backyard for 20 years. The morning was crisp and quiet, with the kind of autumn light that made everything look like a photograph from a better time. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved wife and mother," though I'd questioned that last word every day since the confrontation at Mickey's diner. Jacob's world had collapsed exactly as I'd predicted. The house went into foreclosure within 10 days when the mortgage payments stopped. The BMW was repossessed from the parking lot of his office building, a humiliation witnessed by colleagues who'd spent years listening to his boasts about financial success. Lauren filed for divorce on day 12, citing irreconcilable differences, but taking every piece of jewelry and designer clothing she could carry. What Lauren hadn't counted on was that most of her prized possessions, the diamond necklace, the designer purses, even her engagement ring, had been purchased on credit cards I'd been paying. When those accounts were frozen, the collection agencies came calling. Her new boyfriend, the yoga instructor she'd moved in with, apparently had strong feelings about women who brought financial baggage into relationships. She was out on the street within a month, forced to move back in with her mother in Ohio and take a job at a department store makeup counter. Hannah Campbell had been tracking Lauren's social media downfall with the dedication of a war correspondent. She went from posting about $1,000 brunches to asking for donations to pay her phone bill, Hannah reported during one of our Sunday coffee sessions. Her Instagram went from lifestyle influencer to completely deleted. Apparently, posting about your glamorous life loses its appeal when you're living in your childhood bedroom at 32. I learned about these developments not from Jacob, but from Hannah Campbell, who'd become an unofficial neighborhood correspondent for the unfolding drama. The story had spread through our community like ripples in a pond, each retelling adding new details about the young man who'd lived beyond his means on his father's dime and chosen a party over his mother's funeral. On Thursday of the third week, Jacob appeared at my door. Not the confident, designer-clothed man who'd pitched investment schemes in my kitchen, but someone I barely recognized. His jeans were wrinkled and too big, hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds from stress and poor eating. His face was unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights in the studio apartment he'd rented with his final paycheck. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and watched him enter the house where he'd grown up, but he moved through it like a stranger navigating unfamiliar territory. He sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, but kept his hands folded in his lap as if touching anything might contaminate him with memories of who he used to be. "Lauren left," he said without preamble. "Took everything and moved in with some guy from her yoga class. Turns out she'd been seeing him for months, waiting to see if my financial situation would improve." He laughed, but it was a broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. "She called me a loser who couldn't even manipulate his own father properly." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, mine and one that had been Rachel's favorite, decorated with hand-painted sunflowers from a craft fair we'd visited on our 20th anniversary. Jacob stared at it without recognition, as if he'd forgotten his mother had ever existed in this kitchen. "I lost my job," he continued. "Word got around about the financial problems, and apparently my reputation for reliability took a hit. Amazing how quickly respect disappears when people realize you've been living on borrowed money and borrowed time." He wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink, just absorbed its warmth like someone who'd been cold for weeks. I sat across from him and waited. This was his conversation to have, his apology to make or not make. I'd said everything I needed to say at Mickey's diner, in front of witnesses who'd remember the moment a father finally stopped enabling his son's selfishness. "I keep thinking about the funeral," Jacob said finally, "about what I said, what I did, about Mom lying there while I was worried about ice sculptures and champagne." His voice broke on the last word, and for the first time since he'd walked through my door, I saw a glimpse of the boy I'd raised instead of the stranger he'd become. "I don't even remember what the party looked like," he whispered. "I've got hundreds of photos, but when I try to picture that night, all I can see is your face when I said those words about not being able to bring Mom back. Like I'd physically hit you." The silence stretched between us, filled with the ticking of Rachel's anniversary clock and the distant sound of children playing in the schoolyard 3 blocks away. I thought about forgiveness, about second chances, about the difference between consequences and punishment. "Your mother left me a letter," I said, pulling the envelope from the drawer where I'd kept it since that first terrible night. "She was worried about who you'd become, but she also wrote about who you used to be. The boy who brought me lunch at construction sites. The teenager who worked summers for minimum wage to buy her a Mother's Day present. The young man who called every Sunday just to hear her voice." Jacob's hands shook as he read Rachel's words, her careful observations about his transformation and her hope that losing her might help him find himself again. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and set it on the table between us like a peace offering he wasn't sure he deserved to make. "I don't know how to be that person anymore," he said. "I don't even know where to start." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the backyard where I'd taught him to throw a baseball, where Rachel had grown the vegetables that fed us through lean years, where we dreamed about the successful life we thought we were building for our family. "You start by getting a job," I said. "A real job that pays real money you actually earn. You start by living in a place you can afford with furniture you buy yourself. You start by understanding that love isn't measured in dollars and success isn't measured in Instagram posts." Jacob nodded, but I wasn't finished. "And you start by going to your mother's grave and telling her you're sorry. Not because I'm making you, not because you want something from me, but because you need to say those words out loud and mean them." He left an hour later, walking instead of driving because he no longer owned a car. I watched him disappear down the same street where I'd taught him to ride a bicycle and felt something I hadn't experienced since Rachel's death. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of the crushing weight that had pressed against my chest for weeks. That weekend, I drove to the community college and signed up to teach a construction skills class for students who couldn't afford traditional trade schools. Young people who understood the value of hard work because they'd never had the luxury of taking it for granted. Students who reminded me why I'd fallen in love with building things in the first place. On Sunday morning, I found Jacob at Rachel's grave, pulling weeds from around the headstone with his bare hands. He'd been crying. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but he was talking to her, telling her about the job interview he had Tuesday morning at a local contracting company, about the apartment he'd found that he could actually afford, about his plans to earn back the respect he'd thrown away. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I placed my own roses beside the ones he'd brought. Grocery store flowers that probably cost him more than he could afford, but represented the first genuine gesture he'd made in years. 6 months later, Jacob sent me a check for $50 with a note that said, "First payment on a debt that will take me the rest of my life to repay." I framed the check without cashing it, not because I needed the money, but because it represented something more valuable than any investment scheme he'd ever pitched. The boy who used to bring me lunch at construction sites was finally coming home. But the real change came gradually, in small moments that reminded me why I'd become a father in the first place. Jacob started calling every Sunday, not to ask for money, but to tell me about his week. The satisfaction of completing a difficult roofing job, the pride of earning enough to buy groceries without checking his bank balance twice, the simple pleasure of sleeping peacefully without debt collectors calling. He'd moved into a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Peterson's garage, the same Mrs. Peterson whose kitchen I'd renovated 15 years earlier when Jacob was in college. She charged him $400 a month and threw in home-cooked meals twice a week, the kind of arrangement that happens in small communities where people remember who you used to be before you lost your way. "She makes pot roast just like Mom did," Jacob told me during one of our Sunday calls. I didn't realize I'd forgotten what real food tasted like. All those restaurant meals, all that expensive takeout, none of it had any soul. He'd taken a job with Morrison Construction, starting as a general laborer at $12 an hour. The same company where I'd worked my first construction job in 1978, back when $12 an hour meant something different, but the satisfaction of building something with your hands remained exactly the same. Frank Morrison, the founder's son, remembered Jacob as a teenager and agreed to give him a chance despite his recent reputation for unreliability. "He's got potential," Frank told me when I ran into him at the hardware store. "Good instincts, willing to learn, show up on time every day. Reminds me of someone else I used to know who started at the bottom and worked his way up." The physical labor was teaching Jacob things that years of office work had never touched. His hands developed calluses, his back grew strong, his sleep became the deep, dreamless rest of someone whose body had been used for its intended purpose. He'd lost the soft, pampered look that had made him seem younger than his years, replaced by the lean strength of a man who earned his living with sweat and skill. One Thursday evening in late spring, he stopped by unannounced with a 6-pack of beer and a pizza from Tony's. Not because he wanted anything, but because he'd gotten his first promotion and wanted to share the news with someone who understood what it meant to move up in the construction world through merit rather than manipulation. "Assistant crew leader," he said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. 25 cents an hour raise, and Frank says if I keep improving, I might make a foreman by Christmas. We sat on the back porch where Rachel used to tend her garden, drinking beer and watching the sunset paint the sky the same colors she'd loved in her flower beds. Jacob told me about the bridge his crew was building over Miller Creek, how satisfying it felt to see something permanent take shape under his hands, how different it was to create rather than consume. "I understand now why you never retired," he said, peeling the label off his beer bottle with hands that were finally calloused enough to match his father's. "It's not just about the money, it's about building things that matter, things that last after you're gone." The conversation drifted to Rachel, to memories he'd buried under years of self-absorption, to regrets that couldn't be undone but might, with enough genuine effort, be forgiven. He spoke about visiting her grave every week, not from obligation, but from the need to tell her about the man he was becoming, the man she'd always believed he could be if he just remembered who raised him. As darkness settled over the neighborhood and the streetlights flickered on, Jacob gathered the empty bottles and pizza box without being asked, the automatic courtesy of someone who'd learned to clean up his own messes. At the door, he hugged me, not the perfunctory embrace of someone going through motions, but the fierce, grateful hug of a son who'd almost lost his father through his own stupidity and selfishness. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me completely, for making me earn my way back instead of just forgiving me, because that would have been easier." After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen where this whole story had begun, where he'd asked me for $500,000 while suffering from a hangover earned at a party he'd chosen over his mother's funeral. The same kitchen where Rachel had written her final letter, where I'd discovered the depth of his deception, where I'd made the decision to stop enabling and start demanding accountability. The house felt different now. Not empty the way it had after Rachel died, but peaceful in the way that comes when difficult truths have been spoken and hard lessons have been learned. Outside, I could hear the sound of Jacob's pickup truck starting up, not the BMW I'd unknowingly paid for, but a 10-year-old Ford he'd bought with his own money and maintained with skills he'd learned from working beside men who understood the value of taking care of what you own. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes it means letting people fall so they can learn to stand on their own. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it means watching them climb back up stronger than they ever were before. If you enjoyed this story of justice, family, and second chances, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about Alexander's decision in the comments below. Do you think he was too harsh, or did Jacob need this wake-up call? Click the box on the left to hear another story about family dynamics and the price of taking love for granted. Thank you for listening.